I'm Gloria, 34 female. For the last 6 months, my world had shrunk to the size of the small, two-bedroom apartment I shared with my children. As a data analyst, my job was to find patterns in chaos, to make sense of jumbled numbers and predict outcomes. But since my husband David passed away, the only data point I cared about was the silence in our home, a silence so loud it felt like a physical presence. My life became a simple algorithm of survival: get the kids to school, work from home, make dinner, and try to hold the pieces of our shattered family together. I thought grief was the biggest battle I would ever face. I was wrong. The real war was started by my father-in-law, a man who decided my grief made me an unfit mother, and he was willing to use the full force of the law and a series of calculated lies to take my children away from me. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The 6 months following David's car accident were a blur of condolences, casseroles, and the suffocating weight of paperwork. David had been the vibrant color in our lives, a university professor whose passion for history was infectious. He could make the driest historical event sound like an epic adventure story, and our children, Sophie and Ben, would listen, captivated. Now, the silence he left behind was his final, longest lecture. Our apartment, once filled with his laughter and the sound of him typing away on his latest academic paper, felt like a museum of a life that was no longer ours. His favorite armchair sat empty in the corner, a silent monument. His books lined the shelves, their spines a colorful but heartbreaking reminder of the stories he would never get to tell our kids again. My days were a structured routine designed to keep chaos at bay. At 7:00 a.m., I'd wake the kids. Sophie, at 9, was starting to understand the permanence of our loss, her bright eyes often shadowed with a quiet sadness. Ben, at 7, was a bundle of confused energy, asking when Dad was coming back from his long trip. Each question was a fresh tear in a wound that refused to heal. As a data analyst, I found comfort in order and predictability. I created spreadsheets for everything: meal plans, chore charts, bill payments. It was a flimsy shield against the emotional pandemonium that threatened to overwhelm us, but it was all I had. My work was my only escape, a place where logic reigned and problems had clear, definable solutions. I could lose myself for hours in complex data sets, my mind too occupied to dwell on the gaping hole in our family. David's father, Walter Sterling, had been a peripheral figure during our marriage. A retired judge, he carried an air of unassailable authority. He was a man accustomed to being obeyed, his opinions delivered like verdicts. David had always acted as a buffer between us, translating his father's gruff pronouncements and smoothing over his passive-aggressive critiques. Walter had never explicitly disapproved of me, but I always felt like I was being evaluated and found wanting. I wasn't from the right family, my career wasn't as prestigious as the law, and in his eyes, I was just the woman who had distracted his brilliant son from a more ambitious path. After David's death, Walter's presence in our lives intensified. Initially, I mistook it for concern. He would call daily, his questions sharp and intrusive. Have the children eaten a proper dinner, Gloria? Vegetables, I hope. Are you ensuring they're keeping up with their studies? Their education cannot be allowed to slip. You look tired. A grieving mother can easily become neglectful. Each comment was a small, sharp jab disguised as grandfatherly care. He would take Sophie and Ben for weekends, and they would return quiet and withdrawn. When I'd ask what was wrong, Sophie would just shrug and say, "Grandpa says we have to be strong for you because you're very fragile right now." He wasn't comforting them, he was programming them. He was planting the idea that their mother was broken, incapable. I tried to set boundaries, politely telling him that we were managing and needed our space to grieve as a family. This was met with a cold, dismissive chuckle. "Don't be sentimental, Gloria," he'd said during one tense phone call. "This isn't about your feelings. It's about the stability and welfare of my grandchildren." David would have expected me to step in. He spoke of David as if he had sole ownership of his memory, as if my role as his wife and the mother of his children was a secondary, temporary position. The tension between us simmered, a low hum of animosity beneath a veneer of familial obligation. I knew he was judging my every move, from the takeout I ordered on nights I was too exhausted to cook, to the fact that I let Ben sleep in our bed when he had nightmares. In his world of rigid rules and harsh judgments, there was no room for the messy, unpredictable reality of grief. The last time I saw him before my world truly imploded, he had come to pick up the kids for one of their scheduled weekends. He stood in my doorway, his eyes sweeping over the apartment with thinly veiled disdain. There were toys on the floor and a stack of colorful drawings on the coffee table. To me, it was a home filled with the life of my children. To him, it was evidence of my failure to maintain order. "It's important they have structure, Gloria," he said, his voice laced with condescension. "Children need discipline, not chaos." I remember forcing a tight-lipped smile, handing him their small backpacks, and kissing my children goodbye, telling them I loved them and would see them on Sunday evening. As I closed the door, a shiver of unease ran down my spine. It was a feeling I couldn't quite place, a premonition that the Cold War we had been waging was about to escalate. I had no idea that he wasn't just planning to criticize my parenting anymore. He was planning to end it. The knock on the door came on a Tuesday afternoon. It was a sharp, insistent rap that felt different from a delivery person or a neighbor. I was in the middle of a complex data migration project, staring at lines of code on my dual monitors, a half-empty mug of coffee cooling beside me. The apartment was unnervingly quiet, a silence I still wasn't used to on the days the children were with Walter. I pushed my chair back, annoyed at the interruption, and walked to the door, peering through the peephole. A man in a nondescript polo shirt stood there, holding a large manila envelope. My first thought was that it was a courier with work documents. I opened the door and he asked, "Gloria Sterling?" "Yes, that's me," I replied. Without another word, he thrust the envelope into my hand and said, "You've been served." He turned and walked away before I could even process his words. Served? I stood in the doorway, my heart starting to pound a frantic, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The envelope felt unnaturally heavy in my hands. I closed the door, my mind racing. Served with what? A lawsuit? Had I been in an accident I didn't remember? Was there an issue with David's estate? My hands trembled as I tore open the seal. Inside was a thick stack of papers, stapled together, filled with dense, formal language. The words at the top of the first page leaped out at me, bold and terrifying. Temporary restraining order. I sank onto the floor of my hallway, my back sliding down the cool wood of the door. The legal jargon swam before my eyes, a chaotic sea of petitioner, respondent, whereas, and therefore. But I understood the core of it. The petitioner was Walter Sterling. The respondent was me. And the order, granted by a judge, forbade me from coming within 500 feet of my own children, Sophie and Ben. It granted temporary emergency custody to Walter, pending a court hearing in 10 days. A wave of nausea washed over me. This couldn't be real. It was a mistake, a grotesque, bureaucratic error. My children were supposed to be coming home on Sunday. This was Tuesday. He had kept them from me for 2 extra days, and now this. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers clumsy and shaking, and dialed his number. It rang once, twice, then went to voicemail. I tried again. Voicemail. A cold dread began to seep into my bones. He was doing this deliberately. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an attack. I called my sister, my voice a choked, panicked whisper. "He has the kids," I managed to say. "He took them. He filed a restraining order." "What? Who did?" she asked, her voice sharp with alarm. "Walter, David's father. He's taking my children away from me." The next hour was a frantic blur of tears and terrified phone calls. My sister tried to calm me down, but the words on the page were like poison, seeping into my mind. The order painted a picture of me that was monstrous and unrecognizable. It alleged neglect, emotional instability, and erratic behavior. It claimed I was a danger to my children. Every insecurity Walter had so carefully cultivated over the past 6 months was now laid out in stark, legal terms, twisted into damning accusations. He claimed I was unable to provide a stable home, that I was frequently hysterical, and that I was incapable of caring for them in my fragile mental state. The document stated that the emergency order was granted based on a sworn declaration by Walter, detailing a specific incident that had supposedly proven I was an immediate threat. I skimmed the paragraphs, my vision blurred by tears. It was a work of pure fiction, a grotesque caricature of a grieving widow, but it was official. It had a judge's signature. It was real. The most chilling part was the cold, calculated cruelty of it. He had used his knowledge of the legal system, his authority as a retired judge, to manipulate the truth and turn my grief into a weapon against me. He had waited until he had my children safely in his possession, then served me with papers that legally barred me from getting them back. It was a perfectly executed ambush. I felt utterly powerless, trapped in a nightmare constructed from legalese and lies. I sat on the floor, the papers scattered around me, the silence of my empty apartment mocking me. Sophie's half-finished drawing was still on the coffee table, a colorful unicorn in a field of flowers. Ben's favorite toy spaceship was on the rug. These small, innocent objects were now artifacts from a life that had been stolen from me in the space of an afternoon. The tears came then, not quiet, sad tears, but gut-wrenching sobs of rage and despair. He had taken everything from me. First David was gone, and now Walter was trying to erase me from my own children's lives. The battle wasn't about grief anymore. It was about survival. After the initial storm of panic and rage subsided, a strange, cold calm settled over me. It was the same focus I felt when faced with a seemingly impossible data set at work. The problem was overwhelming, the variables were chaotic, but somewhere within the mess, there had to be a pattern, a key, an error in the code. My children's lives depended on me finding it. I gathered the papers from the floor, smoothing out the crumpled pages, and sat at the dining room table. I poured myself a glass of water, my hands still shaking slightly, and forced myself to read every single word of Walter's sworn statement. Not as a terrified mother, but as an analyst. I needed to dissect his lies, one by one. The statement was a masterpiece of malicious fiction. Walter had woven a narrative that preyed on every stereotype of a grieving, hysterical woman. He described my erratic moods, my uncontrollable weeping, and my neglect of basic household duties. He painted our home as a place of squalor and emotional turmoil. He twisted my exhaustion into apathy, my sadness into instability. It was my word against that of a respected retired judge, and I knew how that would look to an outsider, to another judge who saw only the document in front of them. He had built a fortress of lies, and I was on the outside, unarmed. Then I got to page 3, to the specific incident that had prompted the emergency order. My breath caught in my throat. It was the linchpin of his entire case. According to Walter's sworn declaration, I had driven to his house the previous Friday night, 2 days after he had picked up the children, in a state of absolute fury. He described it in vivid, damning detail. At approximately 9:15 p.m. on Friday, August 22nd, the statement read, Gloria Sterling arrived at my residence unannounced. She began pounding on my front door, screaming obscenities and demanding the immediate return of her children. Her behavior was wild and uncontrollable. When I opened the door, she tried to force her way inside, shouting that I was poisoning the children against her. Her eyes were bloodshot, and I could smell alcohol on her breath. I was forced to close the door on her for my own safety and the safety of my grandchildren, who were awakened by the commotion and were deeply frightened. Her actions demonstrated a profound emotional instability that constitutes a clear and present danger to the children. I read the paragraph again and then a third time. Friday, August 22nd, 9:15 p.m. The details were so specific, so precise, and they were all lies. Every single word was a complete and utter fabrication. I hadn't been to his house. I hadn't even spoken to him that day. A cold, hard knot of anger formed in my stomach. This wasn't just an exaggeration or a twisting of the truth. This was a deliberate, calculated, and entirely invented event. He had created a scene out of thin air and sworn to it under penalty of perjury. My mind, the analytical engine that I relied on for my career, kicked into high gear. I closed my eyes and forced myself to reconstruct that day. Friday. The kids were with Walter. I had finished work around 5:30 p.m. The silence in the apartment was particularly heavy that evening. I remembered feeling lonely and ordering Thai food for dinner. I had spent the evening on the couch, wrapped in David's old university sweatshirt, binge-watching a historical drama on TV. I had exchanged a few texts with my sister. I hadn't had a drop of alcohol. I hadn't left my apartment at all. He had lied, not a small lie, but a giant, foundational one that his entire case rested upon. And in his arrogance, in his absolute certainty that he would get away with it, he had made a critical mistake. He had provided specifics, a date, a time, a location. He had given me data points, and data could be verified. Data could be disproven. A tiny flicker of hope ignited within me. He thought he was untouchable, a former judge who knew every loophole and could bend the system to his will. E saw me as a basket case, an emotional wreck incapable of fighting back. He had underestimated me. He didn't see the data analyst who spent her days finding needles in digital haystacks. He didn't see the woman who could trace a single anomaly through terabytes of information to find the truth. I stood up and walked over to my laptop, my movements now filled with purpose. The tears were gone, replaced by a steely resolve. He had written a story, a calculated fiction designed to destroy me. Now I was going to deconstruct that story, piece by piece, and expose it for the lie that it was. I wasn't just fighting for my children anymore. I was fighting for my sanity, my reputation, and my name. The legal jargon on the papers in front of me no longer seemed so intimidating. It was just a corrupt data file, and I was about to run a diagnostics check that would make the whole system crash. I knew where I was on Friday, August 22nd at 9:15 p.m. I was in my apartment, miles away from Walter's house. And I was pretty sure I could prove it. The thought struck me with the force of a lightning bolt. It was so simple, so obvious, I couldn't believe I hadn't thought of it sooner. My apartment building. It was a modern high-rise with security cameras everywhere, in the lobby, in the elevators, covering every entrance and exit. The unblinking eye of the camera recorded everything, 24/7. It was an impartial, silent witness. My heart hammered against my ribs as I grabbed my keys and headed for the lobby. If Walter claimed I was at his house at 9:15 p.m. on Friday, the security footage from my own building would show that was impossible. It would show me entering the building after work and never leaving. It was the alibi I needed, a concrete, irrefutable piece of evidence that could blow his entire testimony apart. I found the building manager, Mr. Henderson, in his small, cluttered office just off the main lobby. He was a kindly, middle-aged man who always had a friendly word for Sophie and Ben. "Gloria, is everything all right?" he asked, his brow furrowing with concern. He must have seen the frantic, desperate look in my eyes. "Mr. Henderson, I have a very serious, very urgent request," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need to see the security footage from this past Friday night." He looked at me, his expression turning cautious. "Well, that's a bit unusual. We can only release footage with a formal police request or a subpoena. It's building policy." My heart sank. A subpoena, that would take days, maybe weeks. The hearing was in less than 10 days. I didn't have that kind of time. "Please," I begged, the desperation leaking into my voice. "This is a family emergency. It's about my children. Someone has made a false legal accusation against me, and the footage from that night can prove I was here, in my own apartment. Please, I'm desperate." I explained the situation in vague but urgent terms, careful not to sound unhinged. I told him my father-in-law had filed for custody based on a lie, an event that he claimed happened on Friday night when I knew for a fact I was home. Mr. Henderson listened patiently, his gaze softening. He had seen me come and go every day, first with David and the kids, and now just with the kids. He had seen our family shrink. He knew me not as a legal respondent, but as the quiet woman in 9B. He let out a long sigh. "Look," he said, lowering his voice. "Policy is policy. I can't just hand the files over to you, but I can't stop you from looking at a screen in my office, can I?" A wave of immense relief washed over me. "Thank you," I whispered. "Thank you so much." He led me to a small, windowless security room filled with monitors. He pulled up the archive system and navigated to the files for Friday, August 22nd. "Which camera are you interested in?" he asked. "The main lobby entrance and the elevator bank for my floor," I said, "from around 5 p.m. onwards." He located the files and the footage began to play in fast forward. I watched the screen intently, my eyes scanning for my own image. There I was at 5:45 p.m. entering the lobby carrying a bag of groceries. I looked tired, my shoulders slumped. I walked to the elevator, got in, and the doors closed. We switched to the camera for the 9th floor. A few seconds later, the elevator doors opened, and I walked out, heading towards my apartment. "Okay," I said, my voice tense. "Now, can we just let it run? From this point until, say, midnight?" Mr. Henderson nodded, and for the next 20 minutes, we watched the silent, time-stamped footage of the 9th floor hallway. People came and went from other apartments. A neighbor walked her dog, but the door to 9B remained closed. At 7:30 p.m., the footage showed a food delivery driver arriving at the elevator, walking to my door, and leaving a few moments later. That was my Thai food. Then we came to the crucial time. The timestamp in the corner of the screen ticked past 9:00 p.m. Then 9:10 p.m. Then 9:15 p.m., the exact moment Walter claimed I was on his doorstep, screaming and intoxicated. And there it was, or rather there it was. The hallway was empty. My door was shut. I was not on his porch. I was inside my apartment, exactly where I knew I had been. We watched for another hour. The footage was uneventful, boringly normal. I never left my apartment. I let out a shuddering breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "Can you save this?" I asked, my voice thick with emotion. "This specific file, from 5:30 p.m. to 11:00 p.m. Mr. Henderson looked from the screen to my face, and he understood. "I'll export it to a USB drive for you," he said quietly. "For your lawyer, I saw what I saw, you never left." I walked back to my apartment, clutching the small USB drive in my hand. It felt like the most precious object in the world. It was more than just a video file. It was the truth. It was the key to getting my children back. Walter, in his arrogance, had built his case on a lie so specific that it could be dismantled by a single, undeniable piece of evidence. He had no idea that the silent, unblinking eye of a security camera in a quiet apartment building hallway was about to become his judge, jury, and executioner. The fight was far from over, but for the first time since that knock on the door, I felt like I had a weapon. And I was ready to use it. Clutching the USB drive, I knew my next step was to find a lawyer. I couldn't walk into a courtroom alone and just play a video. I was up against a retired judge. This had to be handled with surgical precision. My sister gave me the number of a lawyer a colleague of hers had used in a messy divorce. Her name was Jessica Morales. "She's sharp, she's tough, and she doesn't get intimidated," my sister had said. That was exactly what I needed. I met Jessica the next day in her sleek, modern office. She was a woman in her early 40s with a calm, focused energy that immediately put me at ease. I recounted the whole story, my voice trembling at first, then steadying as I laid out the facts. I handed her the restraining order and Walter's sworn statement. She read through it carefully, her expression unreadable. I could see the skepticism in her eyes. It was a classic he said, she said scenario, and my opponent had decades of legal credibility behind him. "A retired judge carries a lot of weight in the legal community, Gloria," she said, her tone cautious. "His word against yours is a steep hill to climb. A judge will be naturally inclined to believe a former colleague over a respondent he perceives as being emotionally distraught." "I know," I said, my voice firm, "but he didn't just exaggerate, he lied. He created an event that never happened, and I have proof." I took a deep breath and placed the small USB drive on the polished surface of her desk. "He claims I was at his house, 20 miles across town, on Friday night at 9:15 p.m. This is the security footage from my apartment building's hallway for that entire evening. It shows me entering my apartment before 6 p.m. and never leaving. It even shows my food delivery arriving. It's time-stamped. Jessica picked up the USB drive, a flicker of interest in her eyes. She plugged it into her laptop. As the footage played on her screen, her professional demeanor shifted. She watched me walk down the hall to my apartment. She saw the food delivery. She watched the timestamp tick past 9:15 p.m., the hallway remaining empty and quiet. When it was over, she leaned back in her chair and looked at me, a slow, determined smile spreading across her face. "Oh, he made a mistake," she said, her voice dropping to a low, confident tone. "A very, very big mistake. Arrogance is the downfall of many powerful men, Gloria. He was so confident you were a hysterical mess that he didn't think you'd be logical enough to look for something like this. He didn't just lie, he committed perjury. And he handed us the evidence to prove it on a silver platter." For the first time in days, I felt a surge of power. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a plaintiff in the making. Over the next week, Jessica and I worked relentlessly, weaving a digital net around Walter. The video was our centerpiece, but Jessica wanted to build an entire ecosystem of evidence around it, leaving him with absolutely no wiggle room. "We're not just going to poke a hole in his story," she explained. "We're going to obliterate it. We're going to make him look like a fool and a liar in front of a judge." My skills as a data analyst were finally being used for something other than corporate profit margins. I pulled my credit card records, which showed the timestamped transaction for my Thai food order. I downloaded my phone records, which showed my location data, pinging off the cell tower nearest my apartment for the entire evening. I even had the text messages I'd exchanged with my sister, timestamped throughout the evening, discussing the TV show I was watching. Jessica compiled everything into a neat, undeniable timeline. 5:45 p.m., Gloria Sterling enters her apartment building. Source: lobby security footage. 5:46 p.m., Gloria Sterling enters her apartment. Source: 9th floor hallway footage. 7:28 p.m., food delivery transaction is processed. Source: credit card statement. 7:34 p.m., food delivery driver arrives at apartment 9B. Source: 9th floor hallway footage. 8:15 p.m., 10:30 p.m., multiple text messages sent from Gloria Sterling's phone, pinging off the cell tower covering her home address. Source: phone records and cell tower data. 9:15 p.m., Walter Sterling claims Gloria is at his residence 20 miles away. 9:15 p.m., Gloria Sterling is verifiably inside her apartment. Source: hallway footage, phone location data. Each piece of evidence was another thread in the net. Jessica prepared her strategy for the hearing. She wasn't just going to ask for the restraining order to be dismissed. She was going to request that the judge sanction Walter for filing a fraudulent claim and knowingly perjuring himself in a sworn statement. She was also going to file a motion to make him cover all my legal fees. "We go into that courtroom with an undeniable narrative of the truth," Jessica said during our final meeting before the hearing. "His narrative is fiction. Ours is data. In a courtroom, data, when presented correctly, always wins." Walking out of her office that day, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't felt since before David's death. Walter had tried to use the system against me, but we were about to turn that system back on him with crushing force. He had built a house of cards, and we were about to unleash a hurricane. I was finally ready for the confrontation. I was ready to get my children back. The courtroom was a cold, intimidating space of dark wood and high ceilings. It was designed to make you feel small, and as I sat beside Jessica at the respondent's table, I felt a tremor of fear. But then I looked across the room at Walter. He sat straight-backed and imperious beside his lawyer, looking every bit the retired judge. He shot me a look of pure contempt, a look that said, "You don't belong here. You will lose." That look didn't intimidate me. It fueled me. The anger, cold and sharp, pushed the fear away. The hearing began, and the judge, a stern-looking woman named Judge Davies, reviewed the paperwork. Walter's lawyer went first, painting the picture his client had so carefully fabricated. He spoke of my instability and erratic behavior following my husband's tragic death. He described Walter as the concerned grandfather, forced to take drastic measures to protect his beloved grandchildren from their unpredictable mother. Then, he guided Walter through his sworn statement, focusing on the alleged incident at his home. "Mr. Sterling," his lawyer asked, "could you please recount for the court the events of Friday, August 22nd?" Walter cleared his throat, his voice resonating with false gravity. He told the story with chilling conviction, repeating the lies from his statement almost verbatim. The pounding on the door, my supposed screaming, the smell of alcohol. He even added a few new embellishments for effect, describing how Sophie had been crying in her room, terrified by her own mother. I watched him lie under oath, his face a mask of solemn concern, and I felt a profound, sickening disgust. He was using the memory of his own son and the well-being of his grandchildren as props in his sick play. Judge Davies listened, her expression neutral. When he finished, she looked over at Jessica. "Ms. Morales, your response." "Thank you, Your Honor," Jessica said, rising to her feet. She was the picture of calm professionalism. "I have a few questions for Mr. Sterling." She approached Walter, her demeanor polite but firm. "Mr. Sterling, you've just testified under oath about an incident that you claim took place at your residence. Could you please confirm the date and time for the court one more time?" "Of course," Walter said, puffing out his chest slightly. "It was Friday, August 22nd, at approximately 9:15 in the evening." "Approximately 9:15, Jessica pressed. "So it could have been 9:10 or 9:20. "It was 9:15, Walter said with irritation. "I looked at the clock on the mantelpiece when the pounding began. I am very precise about time." "Excellent," Jessica said, a razor-thin smile touching her lips. "Precision is very helpful." She walked back to our table and picked up the USB drive. "Your Honor, we would like to present Exhibit A. It is the complete, unedited security camera footage from the hallway outside my client's apartment from 5:30 p.m. to 11:00 p.m. on the night in question, Friday, August 22nd. Walter's lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection, relevance." "It is entirely relevant, Your Honor," Jessica countered smoothly, "as it will prove that Mr. Sterling's sworn testimony is not just inaccurate, but a physical and temporal impossibility." "Why?" The judge looked intrigued. "Objection overruled. Proceed, Ms. Morales." A large monitor was turned to face the judge and Walter. Jessica played the video. "We saw me enter my apartment at 5:46 p.m. Then she fast-forwarded. The timestamp in the corner was clear and legible. She paused it at 9:14 p.m. The hallway was empty. "Mr. Sterling," Jessica said, her voice cutting through the silent courtroom. "Your home is, by my calculation, a 40-minute drive from my client's apartment in good traffic. To be on your doorstep at 9:15, she would have had to leave her home no later than 8:30. Is that correct?" Walter stared at the screen, his face paling slightly. "I suppose so." Jessica let the video play. The timestamp hit 9:15 p.m. The hallway remained silent and empty. 9:20 p.m., 9:30 p.m., nothing. "Mr. Sterling," Jessica said, her voice like ice. "Where is my client? I don't see her leaving her apartment. I don't see her on her way to your home to cause this terrifying disturbance you so vividly described. Could you perhaps point her out for us?" Walter was speechless. He stared at the monitor, his mouth slightly agape. His confident facade was crumbling before our eyes. But Jessica wasn't finished. "Perhaps my client has mastered the art of teleportation, or perhaps the story you swore to, under penalty of perjury, is a complete fabrication designed to maliciously mislead this court and unlawfully strip a grieving mother of her children." She then presented the rest of our evidence: the phone records, the credit card statement, the cell tower data, each one another nail in the coffin of his lie. The courtroom was utterly silent. Judge Davies stared down from the bench, her face a thunderous mask of fury. She wasn't looking at me anymore. Her glare was fixed entirely on Walter Sterling. When Jessica was done, the judge removed her glasses and rubbed her temples. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice dangerously low. "In my 20 years on the bench, I have rarely seen such a blatant and contemptible abuse of the legal process. You have not only lied in a sworn declaration, but you have repeated that lie here, in my courtroom, under oath. You have weaponized your knowledge of the law to terrorize your daughter-in-law and traumatize your grandchildren." She dismissed the restraining order with prejudice, meaning he could never file one against me on these grounds again. She ordered the immediate return of my children. She granted Jessica's motion for sanctions and ordered Walter to pay every cent of my legal fees. Then, she did something I never expected. She addressed the court clerk. "Please prepare a transcript of this hearing and deliver it to the district attorney's office. I am recommending they investigate Mr. Sterling for felony perjury." The color drained completely from Walter's face. He was no longer a powerful retired judge. He was just a liar, exposed and humiliated. As court was adjourned, he wouldn't even look at me. The unraveling was complete. The reunion with Sophie and Ben was everything. Jessica had arranged for the exchange to happen in the neutral territory of her office lobby, sparing the children the confusion of a courthouse. The moment they saw me, they ran. I dropped to my knees, and their small arms wrapped around my neck, their faces buried in my shoulder. I held them so tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of their hair, tears of overwhelming relief streaming down my face. "I missed you so much, Mommy," Sophie whispered into my ear. "Grandpa was weird," Ben added, his little voice muffled by my coat. "He was sad and then he got really mad on the phone." Hearing that, any lingering shred of doubt about my next decision vanished. This wasn't just about my relationship with Walter. It was about protecting my children from his toxicity and his deception. He had used them as pawns in his cruel game, and I would never allow that to happen again. In the weeks that followed, the consequences of Walter's actions rippled through his life. The news of a retired judge being investigated for perjury was a minor scandal in the local legal community. His reputation, the thing he valued above all else, was in tatters. He was no longer the respected elder statesman, but a cautionary tale about arrogance and abuse of power. He tried to reach out once, through his lawyer, offering a pathetic, half-hearted apology that was more about his own predicament than the pain he had caused. I instructed Jessica to send a single, clear response. All future communication was to cease. He was no longer a part of our lives. The door was closed, locked, and bolted. For us, life began to find a new, better rhythm. The heavy cloud of Walter's judgment was gone, and our small apartment felt lighter, brighter. We filled the silence not with sadness, but with our own noise. We had dance parties in the living room, built sprawling Lego cities on the floor, and I started reading to them every night from the history books David had loved so much, trying my best to mimic the adventurous tone he always used. We were rebuilding our family, not on the broken foundation of what we had lost, but on the new, solid ground of our resilience. I found a new strength in myself that I never knew I possessed. I had faced down a powerful, manipulative man and won. I had used my own skills, my analytical mind, to protect my family. The experience changed me. I was no longer just a grieving widow defined by my loss. I was a fighter, a protector. The data I analyzed at work no longer seemed like abstract numbers. They were patterns, stories, truths waiting to be uncovered. My work took on a new meaning. One evening, a few months later, I was tucking Sophie into bed. She looked up at me, her expression serious. "Mommy, are we going to see Grandpa ever again?" I sat on the edge of her bed and took her hand. I had promised myself I would always be honest with them. "No, sweetie, I don't think we are," I said gently. Sometimes, grown-ups make very bad choices that hurt people, and when they do, we have to keep ourselves safe. My most important job in the whole world is to keep you and Ben safe and happy. She seemed to accept that, nodding quietly. "Okay," she said, "because you're really good at it." Her simple, honest words were more validating than any court victory. That was the only verdict that ever truly mattered. Our lives were not perfect, and the ache of David's absence would always be a part of us. But we were whole. We were free. As I turned off her light and closed the door, I looked around our small, peaceful home. It was no longer a museum of grief. It was a sanctuary we had fought for and won. Our future was a blank page, a new chapter waiting to be written, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt ready to write it.